Well, 63 when I came was the height of the turmoil, being the March on Washington, which was just weeks before I arrived at school. And within weeks after that was the Kennedy assassination.
Wow.
I was on this campus when the word came that your father had been killed. And I think I'm going to put it in a different kind of context. I cannot express how important it is to me that this renaming has taken place. I cannot thank Dr. Christian enough for his courage and tenacity in making it happen, the people who supported him, and even the people who opposed him so that he knew he had to push even harder. You know? Because when I was here as a student, it was pleasant to be with our friends, but there was, as I mentioned in the Know When to Leave the Plantation speech, there were more African students than there were African American. That was a good thing because the campus had a commitment to bringing people from all over the world. So even at that time with the quarter system, we had our social studies sequence was a quarter of European civilization, a quarter of African civilization, and a quarter of Asian civilization. Now, in truth, it was very colonized history of Africa and Asia, but progressive in that context, it was acknowledged that they were civilizations. And we had to really latch on to taking pride in whatever we could take pride in. But I will say that at the same point, the education, and I'm not proud of this, I'm proud to have outgrown it, was such that I remember writing a piece, even, we've talked a little bit, and I'll come back to that, but I wrote a piece for which I got a failing grade for a piece in which I had been creative about the Four Seasons, not Vivaldi's, playing off of the Baroque composer, pre-Baroque composer, Vivaldi, and his piece, The Four Seasons, and I turned it into a life. The professor did not like the fact that I did that, but I got an A for writing a piece that analogized the Ku Klux Klan with the Nation of Islam.
Wait, repeat that? I need to hear that again.
Yeah, you heard it. That the A was given for the false equivalency of analogizing the Nation of Islam with the Ku Klux Klan. Okay? That was the atmosphere. And that was the climate of the country, just as Dr. Christian said, it was a period of time. You know, I mean, even now you hear people say, what's slavery in the North? What are you talking about slavery in the North? We still have that level of denial. We are still struggling to really put the correct information out in the correct context. But so it has been quite a journey from being here in 1963. I think, as I said, at the last speech, I said, wow, it's only taken me 50 years to get from that side of the hall to this side of the lectern. But a lot, thank goodness, has also happened in that 50 years. I could not have, here as a student, I was a theater, I was supposed to be a math student, essentially was there as a music student under kind of clandestine, and then graduated as a theater student. But in this period of time, I also then, my degree from Mills was the first graduate degree in Black Studies. That is quite a change. And then I was ABD on my doctorate, but it would have been the first doctorate in Black Studies. And it was with my doctoral chair being the person you thought was responsible for the name of Huguenot Street. My doctoral chair was Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was the widow of W.E.B. Du Bois that we're talking
The real
about.
W.E.B. Du Bois.
The real W.E.B. Du Bois. The one whose life was not in response to, but whose life was the to be or not to be of his age in terms of activism, dealing with putting things in perspective,
right.
Changing things
That's right.
around. Just like, the false equivalency that I began this by telling you about.
Right. I found it really fascinating when you said, when you attended school here, that the guys would be able to go out, but the girls had a curfew. I thought that was quite interesting.
How many students are in the room now? Do you know what I'm talking about when I refer to hours? Hours meant that girls had curfew. We had to be in by a certain hour. The boys had no curfew. The girls were punished for violating curfew. The boys got to hang out all night and do as they pleased. And that was, Dr. Christian said, the legacy of in loco parentis, and I said, but it was just loco parents. But yes, we had that. What is the strangest thing that was happening when you were a student that has changed now?
When I attended, I remember I had a really good girlfriend who had, in my school, and I was coming here to go to college, and she was going to come and visit me, and she was white. Mm-hmm. And I remember getting on the payphone and calling her and telling her that she couldn't come and visit because it was different here. And so here I discovered, all of the injustices and what it meant. I discovered my father, Malcolm X. I was 15. I had just turned 16 in July, so I was pretty young. And I hadn't read the autobiography of Malcolm X from a very mature place. And so this is where I discovered my father. And it was an emotional time for me, just trying to live up to others' expectations of me. I had never experienced, being out of my mother's protective wing. And, so what I discovered up here is that the Ku Klux Klan lived here, right? And I remember at that time of my life, I was very courageous. And I remember there was one of the students who was missing, and it turned out that he was, he wasn't missing, but we all thought he was missing. And our imaginations had gotten the best of us. And so we were very much a close-knit group. And we went out searching for him, expecting to find the worst. But it turned out that he was okay. So I just remember the time that I was here, that was something that I had, a very close experience to that. And, and I just find that quite fascinating. One of the things I experienced, I go on and I lecture. And so one of the things I experienced is I had gone and I lectured at a university. When I went back to that university 15 years later, it wasn't as, the young people were not as active. And so one of the things that I think is extremely important to always tell young people, especially on college campuses, is whatever challenges you've experienced in your freshman years, if you were unsure of yourselves, if you were discovering more about yourselves, whatever it is you experience, that it is so important when you get to be a junior that you reach back to those freshmen and you have some sort of camaraderie, that you are responsible for your brothers and your sisters, that you are your brother and your sister's keeper. So I think it's absolutely so important because sometimes we just take for granted. We may have people like Dr. Janice Adams, you may have me, you may have your president, your professors who care for you, but if you fast forward 10 years from now, all of the mentoring that you've received, if you're not giving it back or showing the next generation of students who are coming in that they are responsible for reaching back and so forth, that to me was something that I discovered being here in New Paltz. Because I've always been, I come from a family of 6 daughters, right? And, everyone knows when you come from a large family, you're very social, you know to have fun. And, you look at the people of the single children, how many of you are single children?
I'm an only child.
You're only child, right? And, everyone knows the people who come from larger families, we look at those who are only children, you're like, oh, they're a little different, They know how to entertain themselves. They know how to, do these things. But I think it's always so important to put your arm around 2 generations behind you and not take all of this for granted and not be the takers, but take and also give.
Also, I wonder about this. I'm not going to, I don't mean it in a sense of casting aspersions on those who have come behind us, but I do think some of that lack of activism that we perceived actually came because of the period of time. But I don't think it's really, think people are feeling very complacent.
Not this generation. This is it. You guys are it. You are the generation.
Yeah. That's one thing Mr. Trump has done for us. And to show the need of the activism at this time. We've referred to your family and we know the sad parts, the tragic parts. What is your happiest memory of your family, since you're mentioning that you have a large family, which you do? I am in total envy as an only child.
Yeah, we had I had a great family, great childhood. You always had your friends. We had this woman who would come and watch us when my mother was away, and we would say our names forward and backwards to make it appear as if we were speaking different languages. I think that, we had help doing homework. It was all the really great things. And then also, again, when you are a large family of 6 girls, and we were all very close in age, you just kind of have, a very good approach to life. My father had a good sense of humor. My mother had a good sense of humor. And I think, even looking at Malcolm, my father was only in his 20s, right, when the world learned about him. He was only in his 20s. And while young people were demonstrating, marching, protesting for a quality life, for a quality education, healthcare, Malcolm came along and said, we demand respect as your brother, ordained by God. We demand our human rights. And so even my father, coming from a large family and being so serious, right, had a great sense of humor. Yeah.
I just remember that he had a great smile.
Yeah, beautiful person. Yeah. People see the wrong side. We've been so misinformed about people of African ancestry, about indigenous people, and it makes such a difference when we are properly educated. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It makes such a difference.
When Dr. Christian called and said and asked if I'd be interested in doing this and doing this format, a conversation, I was really just so stunned. And I said, I don't think you know what you've just really done. And because Ilyasah and I have just met tonight. Now, we've been speaking back and forth on the phone, and we've curtailed several conversations saying, oh, no, we can't talk too much about that now because we don't want to act as though we've already had the conversation when we're up here. We are really just meeting each other, other than some public things, but to actually say, Ilyasa Janos. This is the first time. However, I actually knew her mother pretty well. When she talks about her mother being away, I mean, her mother did many things, but I remember her mother, I was living in Amherst, Massachusetts, and her mother was taking her doctorate there. And because my husband, there is a significant age difference between my husband and me, but he was actually a very good friend of Malcolm.
Can we tell who your husband was?
Huh?
Can we tell them?
Yeah.
So do you guys know who Max Roach is? That's her husband.
And our daughters are here someplace, yes. But they were very good friends. In fact, there's a chair that is at my daughter Jara's house right now that I remember when I first went to my then not husband's apartment, and I was fascinated with this chair because of the carving and everything else. And he said, well, this is the chair in which Dizzy Gillespie fell asleep. This is the chair in which Charlie Parker used to pretend to be asleep so my mother would say something. And then this is the chair that Malcolm used to sit in at the dining room table, and we would have these phenomenal conversations that would go on all night long. So, it was just hi. And then as well, my grandfather was a Garveyite. Anybody know the name Marcus Garvey, back to African nationalists? And my grandfather I am also here as the immigrant's child. I would like to make that very clear, especially in this time. And my grandfather had come from a Dutch colonized West Indies, St. Eustatius, and he was very much an activist as a Garveyite. And in his later years, every time I saw my grandfather, he had two newspapers, the New York Times and Muhammad Speaks, which was started by her father. I would not say that my grandfather and Malcolm were friends, but they did know each other because Marcus, that park in Harlem that used to be called Mount Mars Park, right below 125th Street and Fifth Avenue, is now renamed Marcus Garvey Park. And that is where the activist Black man of Harlem would gather, and my grandfather was considered a soapbox philosopher. And what he was propounding were the teachings of Marcus Garvey and the Nation of Islam. And then I realized that her grandfather was a Garveyite as well.
My grandfather actually was the president of the Midwestern chapter. And my grandmother, these are Malcolm's parents, because, the reason that I wrote my books is not for Malcolm or Betty to shine, but so that future generations could benefit from their work that had been misappropriated. And so Malcolm's father was the president of the Milwaukee chapter, and he's also responsible for getting Marcus Garvey out of jail for alleged mail fraud. And then his mother was the national...
charges of mail fraud.
Trump.
Well, that too.
Yeah. And his mother was the national recording secretary. So I always say, when you have two young activists, you make sure that your children are well equipped to navigate through societal injustices, challenges, and so forth. And so that was Malcolm's parents.
Mm-hmm. And to have that legacy, I think, my grandmother would say, in this world, all things are one. And then my grandfather, her husband, would say, in this world, let no one contaminate your mind. And that is the kind of training, I think, that is, it's not even just metaphoric. My cousin and I and two others are the four children who desegregated New York City's public schools. I was 8 at the time. The significance and why I mention it in this context is because we're talking about legacies and what's a metaphor, but in a very real sense. The fact that my grandmother and grandfather were immigrants plays a major part in it, because when my December 5th, 1955, Rosa Parks is going to court to protest or to answer the charges that she sat when she should have gotten up and moved to another seat, for a white man who had many other seats in this bus empty that he could have sat in. This is the South, where they love to talk about chivalry. Why did this man want the seat of a black woman? Why did he need this seat when there were so many others? Says something about the atmosphere of intimidation. But December 5th, 1955, as she's going to court to answer for her arrest in Montgomery, my grandmother, at the exact same hour, is in federal court in New York City, pledging allegiance to a flag, promising them freedoms neither will get. The exact same hour, 9 o'clock. So, and none of us knew this at that time. It's with research that you come upon these things. It wasn't until well after my grandmother's death when I happened to find her passport and her citizenship papers. And I looked at the date and I said, but the date, the time, the date, the time, and realized, oh my goodness, it's the exact same hour. So at that point, because she had become a citizen that day, when my family was approached as to whether or not my cousin and I would be allowed to participate in this school desegregation process, they said yes, because they considered that they were giving their children to the country that said it was welcoming my grandparents. That's what that was about. So, when you're talking about Garveyite people, when you're talking symbolic of immigrants, when I studied, I had done a junior high school unit for Scholastic about your dad. And one of the things that really struck me as I was reading about him at that point was just this little boy who was so in love with learning. He wanted to be a lawyer, and just your grandfather and almost this innocence that your grandparents had in terms of their belief that in writing a letter to the president, that the president would stand up for them.
And he actually did. And so my grandfather wrote a letter to then President Coolidge. And when you read this letter, it's floating on the internet. When you read this letter, it sounds much like Malcolm. And he tells President Coolidge that they've they've made a mistake in arresting. Yeah. So you saw the letter?
Yes.
Yeah. So they made this mistake in arresting.
That's why I'm saying it sounded so innocent.
Yeah. Innocent because of the absolute uncontaminated belief that the country would do the right thing where black people were concerned. Right. And it wasn't just where black people were concerned, but it was where a human being is concerned for being falsely arrested. And so it is really important that we learn not to see things from a black and white perspective, but having the capacity to recognize right from wrong and doing something when we see wrong.
It's interesting that you mentioned this book.
Yeah.
You've said a couple of times this issue that it's important that we not just see black and white and this contrast. And I think one of the greatest lessons that I've had in that vein was I produced a series of children's books called the Backpacks, BACKPAX series. And one of the titles that we did was done in Cajun country. And the reason that I, as a Black person, went from Connecticut, where we were living, to Cajun country, Louisiana, is because I was fascinated that at that point they were still referring to Cajuns as white niggers. And in going down and doing this embedding with them, the captain, first of all, it dawned on me 3 o'clock in the morning, no cell phones, no nothing in this period of time, driving along a lonely stretch of route in Louisiana, that I had to be out of my mind. And then but I have this belief that if you set an appointment, you got to make the appointment, and so okay, so I was going to go, and then I turned back, and then I said no. Then I head back there. So I finally got there. The captain was so thrilled, and he didn't know how to talk to me. He said, "Can you imagine your husband?" And then he caught himself. He was about to say, "My husband let me come." And then, so that was one part of the education that we both had to share. The next part of it was that every time they tried to say backpacks, it came out black packs. But they could never say, they couldn't say the word, but they did say how thrilled they were that I would come all the way from Connecticut down to Louisiana to put them on the radio. That was the way they felt about it. And at that point, it was right when Cajun food was coming in, but this issue of maligning these people, and why were the Cajuns maligned? Why in some quarters are they still maligned? Because these were the immigrants who had gone to Canada, and I cannot ignore what that means in terms of indigenous peoples. But for the purpose of this conversation, these were the people who'd gone to Canada as French immigrants, been expelled by the British, ended up having to wind their way down, many on foot, to the next French colony, which would have been Louisiana. That's how they got there. And then they became this despised, lowest of the low because they are immigrants, and that moniker of white niggers stuck. And I learned from that, and from being with the people, what I learned is that, and I think it's the takeaway that I want to, for the moment, in this part on, was that it had nothing, racism, in that moment I realized racism had nothing to do with anyone as individuals. It had to do with power. It had to do with ill-gotten gain of advantage. And it had to do with who you could put down in the name of lifting yourself up. But it had nothing to do with the people it was being imposed on. And
who you could put down so that you could build yourself up. So it makes you feel good.
Yes.
Makes you feel like you're a big man.
Yes.
When you impose this false sense of
so these people
inferiority on others. It gives you this false sense of superiority.
And that was the excuse for maligning these people. I think we are approaching a time to do Q&A. If anybody has questions that they would like to raise, is there a microphone that that people can ask questions into? We are recording this. It will be archived here at school, and I have gotten Ilyas's permission, and the school has given me permission that it will run on my radio show. So you'll hear about that. But do we have microphones?
Yeah, right here.
Good. Does anybody have a... Okay. I'm seeing hands. All right. How many microphones are there?
Yes.
2.
Okay, so since you're there, that will be the next person. Yes.
Yeah.
And first, you're at the first person. Oh, it's a box microphone. Okay.
I don't know. I think you're up.
All right.
Who's that? Do you just speak into this?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So,
Don't burp.
in the
I'm not able to hear you.
okay, in the beginning, you mentioned Ilyasa about right and wrong and being able to know the difference between right and wrong, and there are passionate, intelligent, convicted people who have ideas that are so opposite of what I consider right and wrong, who consider themselves right and me wrong. So how do you right size that and sort that through? Because you want to try to, I think a lot of it is pressed upon us, and I think a lot of us are divided purposefully. And so, right or wrong, I like to stay open to why someone else thinks right and wrong is opposite of what I think right and wrong, but try to stay open to, keep my heart open to what are they thinking? And so, what are they thinking? Or how do you write that with your statement that said...
So what I do with my students, I think it's extremely important to understand history, right? And I'm so proud of my students when they do these presentations where they do the research prior to... One of the courses that I teach right now is Perspectives on Justice in the Africana World. And so what they get to do is they get to research why is there injustice in all of the Africana world? What are they seeking? Who are they fighting to get their justice from, right? So we get to revisit our education, right? We get to visit history in the truest sense. So we get to learn about the different empires prior to slavery, because we all learned about slavery, right? But we didn't learn the truths about slavery we're discovering today. My father said, if you put a knife in my back 9 inches and you take it out 6 inches, the knife is still in my back. So it's absolutely important that in order to address the wound, we have to have a discussion about it, right? So it is absolutely so important that we go back and we re-educate ourselves. We have been miseducated, especially when it comes to the African diaspora, when it comes to people, indigenous people. And so when you learn history in its real, true form, that's a start. And the discussion has to be had. And I think that discussion is being had today. Once you learn these things, we have to make sure that we are teaching our children. We have to be responsible for the educational curriculum that they have. And once we understand the truths in our history, when we can look at those people of African ancestry and American ancestry, indigenous American ancestry, the brown, black and brown indigenous Americans, once we understand the significant sacrifice they made in spite of being terrorized generation after generation after generation, and we look at the significant contributions they made that enabled each and every American person the opportunity to call the United States of America their home, then we can properly teach our children. We have time to respect. We have time and the capacity to see right from wrong, as long as the smart, forward-thinking adults is taking responsibility to ensure that our children are learning the truth and not this one-sided part of something that didn't really exist. Because you can't have that, people inserting themselves everywhere around the world where there's some great accomplishment. They were in Egypt, they were in Benin, they were in Mali, they were everywhere. So we have to be realistic. and make sure that we take responsibility for teaching our children the truth about history. The beauty of America is that we get to experience the diversity of the world's nations, the different nationalities.
I just want to.
Yes, absolutely.
I just have two quick things that I want to say about that. One is I mentioned the school desegregation process. As an 8-year-old, I'm walking into school and you have these grown-ups screaming and hollering, tearing at my clothes and spitting at me. Mm. I don't want to hear about your politics. I just want to ask, who are you? You know, what kind of person thinks it's okay to do that to a child? So to me, some of this is on that very basic level, you know. The next thing that is important to me on this subject is that in this country, there is a great intertwining of religion and bigotry. We have to be honest about that. And we use the religion as an entitlement to say it's not us, God told us to do this. Okay? I don't know one religion in the world that does not have at its basis, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So when I hear, to be honest, to me, the false equivalency of turning around what is right and what is wrong and making what is wrong right, and, you know, I mean, in the era of slavery, what was right was wrong, what was wrong was right, what was right was legal, what was wrong was legal. I mean, when you have to go through that kind of confusion, that to me is really do unto others as you would have them do unto you, not in a Pollyannish way, but in a very pragmatic way. To me, there was another question up there. I know they have a microphone. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay. I have two questions. My first question is, do you think...
May I ask you to direct the microphone?
My first question is, do you think that it's possible to have another Malcolm X or another Marcus Garvey, another Martin Luther King in this day and age now? That's my first question. My second question is, you mentioned...
I would say yes. Yes. There's absolutely.
My second question is, you mentioned that racism is about how to put someone else down to lift yourself up. But how do you, for a lack of a better term, combat that, or do you combat that? Like, how do you handle that amongst yourself to deal with that on a daily basis? Because it's there regardless. So you still have to deal with it within yourself. But how would you recommend to do that?
You want it?
I just think that at a certain point, those of us who know better have to do better. And therefore, at this age, I cannot put a lot of time into people who don't know right from wrong and think they are exempt. But I mean, you know, come on.
Right.
Wherever they are, you know, and so I think to me it's about, you mentioned, you know, the networks and the mentoring that you get here. I think it is about using this time and space, whether you're faculty, students, wherever we are, using our humanity and the fact that we are together in a positive, safe space, use it well. And build your craft of how you treat other people well, how you bring about the best in yourself, how you use yourself to lift that other person, how you create your posse. I think that is the best use of time, other than concentrating on someone who's hell-bent on not getting it.
Right.
Do you have the mic?
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon. My question is, I went to a predominantly white boarding school, and a lot of the underclassmen are still reaching out to me and letting me know that there's, like, I don't know, racial injustice on campus and white privilege that's going unaddressed. So my question for both of you would be, what would you tell them to stay, keep advocating and make sure that they know that complacency is not an option, especially in today's America, for things like that are going on campus, like people using the N-word and that sort of thing. So what I'm asking is basically, what would you recommend that I tell them about the importance of continuing to advocate and be advocates, because people understand, like you said, it's very possible to have more Martin Luther Kings or Malcolm X's, but nobody wants to do the work. Or in being a Black woman, we often get titled angry or
Get focused on that.
Yeah.
Because the thing is that even during the time of Malcolm X and during the time of Harriet Tubman said, if I could have convinced, I don't like the word enslaved, but she said, if I could have convinced more slaves that they were slaves, I could have freed thousands more. So no matter what, you're always going to have challenges. You just have to be steadfast, focused. So her question is, if she went to a prep school, and most of her peers back there now are saying that there's such white privilege, what kind of advice would you give her?
I don't understand. Are the Black students saying?
There's white privilege. So her school that she attended, she's just maybe 3 Blacks in her school.
Oh, okay.
And so they're complaining that, it's difficult to navigate because there's...
The necessity...
What grade are you in?
I'm a sophomore. Here's the speaker.
Here. Okay.
But
I'm a sophomore at New Paltz, but since I graduated, I still have underclassmen that I reach out to and communicate with, because I was head of inclusivity at my old school. So they're telling me that there are issues with white privilege, or just from the teachers, certain things that need to be addressed that aren't being addressed, because some of the girls are afraid of being labeled as angry and not listened to, if that makes sense.
How far away is
what school is it?
It's in Virginia on the Rappahannock River. It's very conservative.
Well, I was thinking also that if they were more local, that you could have invited them to spend time with you on campus. I cannot say that in that environment that you are going to that people are going to be convinced that it's okay to back off their privilege, because that's what it really is. Why should I have to give up? Yeah, I know I'm privileged, but why should I have to give it up for you? That's what the real issue is, and that I'm not going to. Power never concedes without the demand. It never has, and it never will. Douglas.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Erica said we should always end with singing, because I did the last time. So I'll finish after.
Erica said that she should end with a song. Right?
So after you finish, if you'll let me.
Well, no, you go ahead. I was going to, in the questions, and offer a couple housekeeping details before I thank you. But let's go ahead. I don't sing in public, but you all go ahead.
This is a matter of personal privilege. Thank you. It is very rare that I just wanted to, we're talking about young people, and I just wanted to read something from my book, Sister Days, that will wrap up, I hope we'll wrap this up, and then we will end with singing, I promise. Sometime in 1621, we cannot be sure exactly when, a woman known only as Isabella gave birth to the first African child born in the Americas. Her husband's name was Anthony, and their baby was later baptized William in the Church of England at the Jamestown colony in Virginia. That is all we know, and yet we know more. Recently ripped from their former lives, what horror William's parents must have seen. But in his eyes, they could see hope and promise and for that they must have lived and dreamed their better days. On this day, this author's daughters, Ayodele Naila and Dara Rashida, November 2nd, were born in New York City in 1971. It's their birthday this week. Their father, Max Roach, had come to Brooklyn as a child, his parents fleeing the Depression and the Jim Crow South. His parents had been born in a section of the historic Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina. Their parents were among the post-war emancipated who symbolically claimed it and renamed it New Land. In this promise was their future, their all. As their mother, my father, Bertel Adams, had come, as their mother, my father, Bertel Adams, had come to the States from St. Kitts as a child, his mother having seen both of her twins die. My mother, Muriel Tuitt, was American-born to two immigrants, William Landsmark and Myra Carlisle, was a twin herself. It is for my daughters and yours that these and many other books have been written. Like Isabella, in spite of all that has happened to us as a people, in our children's eyes, we see hope. How can we say to our children, to your children, and to mine any less than thank you, Dara, thank you, Ayo, happy birthday to all our young people. Happy
Are we going to sing?
We can sing happy birthday to all of us in this room. Happy birthday. Or we can sing the Stevie Wonder happy birthday. Happy birthday to ya. Happy birthday to ya. Happy birthday. And that's all I know is the chorus. Happy birthday to ya. Happy birthday. That will do it. They get the message. Thank you.